In this video, I'm going to reveal to you how the Canadian housing super mega bubble, whatever you want to call it, comes to its sticky demise and how that will happen. Understanding these things is really important. I think it's so important to just understand this. So let's get right into it. So Toronto home prices, let's illustrate it using Toronto housing prices. Toronto is one of the biggest real estate markets in Canada. It's been the poster child for this mega super bubble, whatever you want to call it, and it has just absolutely exploded, as you can see from this chart right here. Prices have just absolutely exploded. So if we look at this chart and we go all the way back to 2003 here, you can see that for a detached home up there in the top right hand corner, $336,000. Right now, it is $1.421 million. So that's around 320% in growth of housing prices in Toronto. Do you think incomes have gone up by that much? I know you don't, because you watched the live stream that we did a couple of days ago that literally told us that, hey, incomes have gone up around 60% in nominal terms. And we know that actually in real inflation adjusted terms, when we look at the 1980s CPI, which is this one right here, which is more accurate than the CPI that they use now. You can see the red line is the CPI that they use right now, and this is the 1980s based CPI, and there's a link to this in the description. This is a US based chart. We don't have the data here in Canada, but still it doesn't matter, because the US and Canadian CPI are essentially tied at the hip, more or less. They're just slightly different in different ways. That's why the Canadian one is lower than the American one. But when you look at them, they're tied at the hip in the way that they move. So we can use this. Yes, we can use this. So when you look at that, somebody asked me a fantastic question on the last stream. And they asked, well, hey, how can you have negative wage growth of more than 100%? And that is a great question. And that brings me to this, which is the super bubble. So you've seen, and it's not just mortgage debt, but we're focusing on that in this video. It's practically everything since 2008. So it started around 2003. You went from 500 billion all the way up to 2.07 trillion. And this is outstanding balances in mortgage debt. So that is just unbelievable when you think about it, because the population during that time, how much do you think the population has grown by during that time? Well, we can look at this chart. If we go to 2003, 31.64 million to right now in 2021, that's the latest data we have, 38.25 million. So you are talking about around a 20% growth in the population during that time. So that does not make up for the fact that this has gone up 333%. That is a massive amount of growth, 333%. And that is why the bank's earnings have gone parabolic as well, because they have been making so much money out of creating these loans. And this is what creates the new money into the economy. This is what creates a lot of inflation. This is the new dollars that are going into the economy. So it's very interesting when you think of it that way, because that is the reality. When a new loan is created, that's new dollars that go out into the real economy. They don't take that out of your checking account. So very interesting. And then, one more thing that I thought was just incredibly interesting is the yield curve right now. What is the yield curve telling us? Well, the yield curve is screaming at us that some sort of disaster is going to happen. And really, it's because of what is happening with the mortgage debt. And the mortgage debt has finally started to slow down. The growth is slowing because essentially we've got to the ceiling, it seems like right now. We're hitting against the ceiling. And when I say the ceiling in which people can afford these payments. Because like I said earlier, how can you have negative wage growth that goes below 100%? You can't. It's impossible. So how does that work? Well, essentially what you have happen because if you adjusted incomes to that 1980 CPI, you would be negative wage growth of 144%. So how is that possible? Well, it's subsidized through this. It's subsidized through debt. This went up 333% during the same period. We know that wage growth has not supported it. So we know that essentially the lost income that people have, they are using debt to replace that lost income. And essentially anybody, just thinking about it in that simple way can understand that this thing cannot last. It just can't last. It is literally impossible, because eventually the debt that people have gets so large that they hit a ceiling in the amount they can afford for the payments, and then they start to default, they get foreclosed on, they lose all these possessions, and everything happens like we saw in 2008 in the US. And that's essentially what Canada is going to go through. It's essentially what's going to happen, whether people like it or not. So I think this is really, really interesting. The debt has subsidized people's income over that period. So I think that you really have to just understand that this chart really just corresponds to the amount of mortgage debt that Canadians have took out, the amount of outstanding debt. And we know from this chart as well that, hey, it's not a question of people are arriving with bags of money. That is not what's happening. I don't care what people are telling you. That is not what's happening, because we know it's not happening, because we just have to look at the mortgage debt. We just have to look at the housing prices, and we can see that the two are tied at the hip, because this is the really shocking thing. If homes went up 325% around that number, and mortgage debt went up 333%, it's essentially the same. So essentially mortgage debt, that is what has grown the housing market to this unprecedented level. But it's not like it's being paid back. None of it is being paid back. And the reason it's not being paid back is because people believe that there's always going to be a greater fool. There's always going to be somebody around the corner that is going to pay a higher price for this. And it is a stupid, dumb mentality that will end up for a lot of people in bankruptcy court, because you can't, like, that is unsustainable. And the way people have stacked domino behind domino behind domino in terms of using debt for down payments and all the rest of it has just created an even bigger disaster. And that's why we saw that massive blow off top that we saw in 2021. And now we're stuck in this denial phase of the bubble. And when you're in the denial phase, essentially you've got a lot of sellers that are holding off. They don't want to sell right now. The prices, they're waiting for them to turn and start going back up. And then what you can essentially have happen is they do turn, they start to go back up. It's called a bull trap. And then all of a sudden they just rush onto the market. All the sellers go onto the market, and then the prices just go down even further. And then coupled with that, you have an economic crisis, which is what the yield curve is predicting. Because, you know, during the late 1980s, was that a good time for Canada? Well, a lot of you can let me know in the comments, and you have done on prior videos. It was not a good time. In fact, half of all financial institutions that went bust during this time. I've said that so many times, but people need to understand that was a seriously bad time, and it was another real estate bubble that happened and stock market bubble that happened. And essentially, we've got a very similar thing that has happened over the past 10, 15 years. And, you know, Canada in 2008 was on the low end in terms of the size of the bubble, so it didn't really get impacted by 2008. But now it's on the extreme risk end of the scale compared to last time when it was on the low end, didn't really get hit that bad. This time it's on the extreme end because essentially they used that as an opportunity to drop rates to the floor, which essentially sent people on a borrowing madness trail, essentially. So people went borrowing all this money for everything, mostly real estate that we know of. And that has just created a huge problem. And it's not just real estate, actually. It's also private businesses that have piled on debt since 2008. And I've done many videos on the past and some of which I will link at the end of this video. So I think it's very, very important to look at these things and just realize what they mean, realize how unsustainable they really are moving into the future. You cannot have this thing just continue to go along at the pace it's going on right now. People just don't understand, but I know a lot of you guys do on this channel, that this thing will end, and it will end very, very badly. And this will have to come down. A lot of these loans will have to be destroyed, because nobody is going to pay them back. Everybody is relying on the greater fool. And once that greater fool isn't there again, it all goes wrong. It all goes horribly wrong. And we've already seen that happen. They accelerated that for us by raising interest rates. And now the yield curve is screaming bad things are going to happen. And every time that they hike, the yield curve gets more inverted. So that is telling you that with every hike, they're pushing this debt bubble even more to the extreme. So the chances of collapse are 99.9%. And I'm just leaving that tiny, tiny fractional just in case they decide to hyperinflate, because that's always an option. And I would, I think that would be a massive depression and crisis, and I don't think they would take that option, but it is an option. And who knows with Trudeau and his government is so bad with fiscal policy. It's unbelievable. I mean, all governments are, but his government especially. So if you've enjoyed this video, you might like this one here. You might also like that one there, and I will see you on the next one. Take care of yourselves, guys. Bye-bye.